So last year when I was abroad, I studied at the Political Science Institute of Lyon. It was an amazing experience. I really got to see how the rest of the world sort of views politics and international relations and things of this nature. It was fascinating to see from the other side just how the rest of the world, or especially the French world, sees the United States. While I was there, I took classes in international relations, international organizations, geopolitics, global economy, economics, constitutional law, and the transition from there was actually quite a lot easier than I thought it would be. The political science department here promotes strongly kids going abroad, and they try to facilitate the process as much as possible. And I found the classes to be hard, but the system is quite different, and I think this is kind of what leads to it. You sort of have class once a week for 3 hours, and you have one final exam that's worth your entire grade. You're not given reading lists, you're just given a giant bibliography of all the classes that are all the possible books that would help with the class. And so I adapted fairly quickly, but it was a bit of a shock at the beginning to sort of, realize that the system is very much more based on independent student work, and in the end I found this to be beneficial. So my institution last year placed a high amount of value on cross-cultural interactions. So I took several classes with professors who came from outside of France. I actually took a history of Africa class with a man from Cameroon. This was an amazing experience because I really got an insider's perspective on the actual topic that I was studying. This man was one of the foremost experts in African history, especially Cameroon history, and I think this was an experience that I don't think I could have had at Santa Barbara, just because of the nature of my school that I was at while I was abroad was so heavily based on international interaction. So within French culture, they place a high amount, immigration is a very large factor, especially immigration from North Africa. And so I felt that it was sort of prudent and essential while I was abroad to actually visit some of these countries. So I did a 10-day trip with a bunch of my friends to Morocco, and that trip was the trip of a lifetime. And seeing the relationship with what I was seeing in France, with racial interactions, and then seeing kind of the origins of this really directed my field of studies, and I actually want to go to grad school and study that whole entire region, the North African Mediterranean region. So yeah, it was definitely a very influential year on the course of my studies, and really kind of what I found to be interesting, because I really got a first person on hand sort of interaction with some of these people, and it really changes you. So my experience abroad in terms of learning of French was shocking, to say the least. When you leave to go, you really leave with a sort of sense that you have an understanding, I guess, of the language, and that I left with sort of like, okay, I don't know all that well, but I know it well enough to where I'll be able to communicate. But when you get there and you arrive like on the land and you live there for an extended period of time, you really realize that language is constantly changing, and that by learning a language in a classroom experience, like, yes, you're getting the basics, but the way in which people actually speak is just so radically different, and so radically affected by culture and by the way that people decide to interact with each other, that you really have to go to the country and kind of be in it every day and sort of see how people actually interact with each other, I think, to ever really have any sort of grasp on the language. And so I feel that experience abroad and experience in a country that speaks the language that you're trying to learn is essential, is utterly essential to learning the language. So being a student in France is actually quite different than being one in the United States. Their student bodies are a lot more politically active and politically involved. I remember we had a strike at my school, and the students actually barred the doors with tables and chairs. So for some of the French students, that they were sort of kind of getting frustrated with the strike, but for us as American kids, it was such a great experience, such an interesting time. Also, I lived with 3 French students while I was abroad, and I can't highly recommend this enough. You get such a better sense of what it's like to be, be in French culture. You get an understanding of slang, which I had that I don't think any of the other kids in my program really got, and you also get like the social benefits. We went out a lot, like being in a big city, a lot more space on going out to a bar or a nightclub or something like that, or even a big thing in France is they have the quays, which are basically the banks of the river. It's sort of like these big kind of almost parks on the side of the river, and everyone goes out, and there's just hundreds of people sitting out on there, kind of with bottles of wine, just kind of hanging out, sitting in the grass, and that was like my favorite thing to do of the entire time. We would, you'd go out there and just spend the whole night out there, and then towards the end of the night maybe go to a club or a bar or something like that. But really got a first-hand look into what it was to be a French student in modern-day France. So where I was in France, Lyon is actually considered to be the gastronomical capital of France. It's sort of perfectly positioned in the middle of many agricultural areas, and it's sort of positioned between the sea and Paris and all that. So it is sort of a gastronomical hub, and restaurant culture in France, but even particularly in Lyon, is a critical aspect of everyday life. You can't go to a French restaurant without being there for 2 hours and having 3 bottles of wine, and you eat a full 6-course meal, and you need to be rolled home. And the food was perhaps my best memory. I remember the first time we all went out to dinner, and everyone was just like, "Oh my God," like moaning over how great the food was. So that was just definitely awesome. So my 2 recommendations that I've kind of told a lot of people about going abroad is, first, if at all possible, try to live with students, and even better, live with students from the country in which you study. And my second biggest tip is to not get frustrated. Going abroad can be a very, at times, difficult experience. Like for me, I was stressed out in the beginning about, like where am I going to live? I can't talk to anybody because they all speak a different language and all that stuff. And as soon as I got out of that, and I sort of was like, oh, like I got my house, I started getting the language down. It was persistence that really had helped me get there, and really, in the end, made my experience better. Because I remember there were kids that sort of gave up necessarily on learning the language. They sort of struggled with it, and it just completely changes your experience. And once you get the language down and you get sort of a comfortable feel for it, it'll just explode on you, and you'll just get an entire, the floodgates will be open, and you'll be able to learn so much more and adapt so much more quickly. But it just takes that period of kind of being persistent and continually speaking the language and focusing on the language. Yeah, so I was in France for a year, and I don't regret it at all. I think it's definitely the best way to go. I think people get hung up on how long a year is, and they think it's going to be an eternity. And in all honesty, especially my second semester went by like that. It went by in a flash. And for the kids that were there only a semester, they sort of arrive, start learning the language, start getting a hang of it, and by the time they're sort of starting to feel comfortable, then it's time for them to leave, and they miss out on the sort of really living there and really being there. In my experience, the difference between the year and the semester is more of it's sort of a cultural interaction, it's sort of a cultural introduction, it's sort of I don't want to say, it's almost a vacation at times, whereas being there a year, it's truly getting into the culture and truly understanding what it is to live there and what it is to be there, and what it is, you begin to get this sense of community where you actually feel a part of of the area that you live in. I mean, I remember I started going to stores and stuff, and people would recognize me, and I would, you know, ask them how they were doing, how's their day, like all this stuff. You really sort of get a chance to develop those friendships and those connections that really kind of tie you to the place and really get you a passion for where you are.